On the night of December 31st, 1862, as America was in the midst of a civil war, blacks who had freedom living in the United States gathered at churches or other safe places while thousands of their enslaved black sisters and brothers stood, knelt, and prayed on plantations and other slave-holding sites in America, all for the same purpose. They waited anxiously for President Abraham Lincoln to sign the Emancipation Proclamation into law. This act began the tradition of watch night service among the black community in America. It symbolizes the historical fact that on September 22, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, a document which legally recognized that the Civil War was fought for slavery, and the end result brought an end to over 300 years of human bondage in the United States. Unfortunately, this ritual would not be known or practiced by the slaves of Texas for another 2.5 years. As Southern slave owners struggled desperately to maintain their standard of living, they continued on in open defiance of federal law until June 19, 1865, when Union Major General Gordon Granger arrived on the island of Galveston, Texas, to take command of more than 2,000 federal troops who had recently arrived in Texas to enforce the emancipation of its slaves and oversee a peaceful transition of power, additionally nullifying all laws passed within Texas during the war by Confederate lawmakers. It might surprise you that long before it was known as a watch night service, black congregations, especially those in the South, already had a tradition of gathering on New Year's Eve prior to the Emancipation Proclamation. According to Valdosta State University history professor Dr. David Williams, blacks often met on New Year's Eve because New Year's Day for many black people in the slave-era South was known as Heartbreak Day. New Year's Day was often the day when slaveholders sold slaves, when families, parents, and children, husbands and wives were separated permanently. Slaves gathered on New Year's Eve because that may have been the last time many families had the opportunity to be together. But that all changed when the clock struck 12 midnight on December 31st, 1862, when a night of heartbreak became henceforth known as Freedom's Eve. The Emancipation Proclamation was in full effect, and for those who were informed of their new freedom, jubilation and celebration spread throughout the land. In the decades since slavery and the Emancipation Proclamation, our people have maintained a steadfast reverence for this sacred tradition. Watch Night has evolved into an evening that honors the past, both within Texas and nationwide, as we celebrate family, fellowship, new beginnings, and take an opportunity to rededicate our lives to Christ and become newly optimistic about the future.
The first watch night service in 1862 can be traced back to gatherings also known as Freedom's Eve. On that night, black slaves and freed blacks came together in churches and in private homes all across the nation, awaiting for January 1st, 1863 to become a reality, because it was on that day that they would indeed receive their freedom. The Emancipation Proclamation would become law. My name is Dennis Oglesby, and we're discussing Freedom's Eve, or more importantly, what we know as the first watch night service. It was at the stroke of midnight, January 1st in 1863, when blacks freed and enslaved everywhere fell on their knees, began to praise God and celebrate that they were finally free. And blacks everywhere, after a century later, still gather in churches and in homes to anticipate and remember what God has done and to anticipate what God will do in the coming new year. Services usually start somewhere around 7 or 9 o'clock and they end just after 12. But people spend the time thanking God for how God has kept them and how God has brought them to another year. They remember with glad hearts what God has done, and they anticipate with loving hearts what God will do in the new year. And this is still a celebration that we carry out today. Some people come to church at first just to visit, but when they get involved in the service, they can't help but make it an annual event. What a wonderful way to start off a new year, by celebrating what God has done and anticipating what God will do.